Welcome, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Sunny Yudkoff, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of German Nordic Slavic, the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, and I also work with the George L. Mosse Program in History, along with Sky Donnie, who's here tonight as well. And I have the pleasure also of teaching this semester in the Mosse Humanities Building. The legacy of George L. Mosse looms large on campus, and it's a testament to his scholarship and his philanthropy that we have had the chance to learn from and think with Professor Zahra over the past 2 days, and again tonight. Tonight we'll have the chance to hear about what she has suggested is the third phantom of migration, separated families. As the concluding lecture in the series, and I think we may want to close that door, Sky, thank you. The Gallery of Vanished Husbands, Picture Brides, and Lost Children, How Migration Made the Modern Family. Professor Zahra comes to us tonight by way of the University of Chicago, where she is the Homer J. Livingston Professor in History. She's most recently the author of The Great Departure, Mass Migration and the Making of the Free World, which came out with Norton in 2016. Her previous multi-award-winning books include The Lost Children, Reconstructing Europe's Families After World War II, Harvard, 2011, and Kidnapped Souls, National Indifference and the Battle for Children in the Bohemian Lands, Cornell, 2008. And since her edited work has only thus far been alluded to, I also want to mention the 2018 edited volume, Objects of War, The Material Culture of Conflict and Displacement, co-edited with Leora Auslander and published with Cornell. Alongside these works, she's been the recipient of numerous distinguished awards, including the MacArthur Genius Grant in 2014 and NEH Fellowship in 2013, as well as the Berlin Prize at the American Academy in Berlin that same year. She's also been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2017. Now, yesterday, Professor Catherine Ciancia eloquently summarized some of Professor Zahra's distinguishing qualities as a historian, including, for example, her insistence that Eastern and Western European history be situated in the same analytical framework, rather than simply serving as foils one to the other. She also mentioned her keen sense of how the history of minoritized groups in Central and Eastern Europe animate larger questions of migration, belonging, and nationalism across Europe writ large. And finally, she mentioned how Professor Zahra's intellectual questions are consistently pursued with curiosity and empathy. I want to add here that her work to rethink the so-called hybrid identities in the Central European borderlands, her effort to draw our attention to the nationalist stakes in constructing and deconstructing, and her words romanticizing and demonizing these notions of hybridity, have been a continuous touchstone in my own thinking and teaching in the field of modern Yiddish literature. So by way of closing, I want to draw here attention to another of Professor Zahra's qualities as a historian, namely her mentorship of graduate students. When asked about Zahra, her students consistently answer with some version of "she's amazing." And the simplicity of the superlative belies the depth of her commitment. When I was a lecturer at the University of Chicago, I had the chance to teach Yiddish to a number of her graduate students, and I witnessed firsthand her patience as a scholar mentor, her ability to ask supportive if critical questions, and her genuine enthusiastic supports for students on the cusp of an archival analytic breakthrough. Professor Zahra always takes the time to ask junior colleagues and graduate students eager to discuss her work, what they are working on, what they are researching, and how it is all coming together. I think I speak for us all when I say I'm looking forward to learning more tonight, so please join me in welcoming Professor Zahra.
And I want to thank all of you who have taken the time to come to even one lecture. Some of you have come to 3. That's way above and beyond the call of duty. And thank you also to everybody who's taken the time to meet with me and talk to me about my own work and their work. I've just really enjoyed all of these conversations. And I've already kind of come away with a number of new ideas about this project that made me think I should, wanted to revise the talk before I started, but I didn't have time to do that. So hopefully we'll just continue the conversation. For those of you who were here on the first day, I began this series with a talk on runaways, on migrants who migrated to get away from their family members. And as I mentioned then, the truth is that most migrants did not actually want to get away from their families, although the runaways, I think, are extremely interesting and can tell us a lot about the history of migration. But long before children were ripped from their parents' arms on the southern borders of the United States, millions of families were involuntarily separated by American and European immigration policies. This separation of families has sometimes been an unintentional byproduct of migration restrictions or a consequence of war. Sometimes separation has occurred by choice or by necessity as families made decisions or individuals made decisions to try and improve their lives. But throughout the 20th century, family separation has also been used as a deliberate tool of migration policy and a form of population politics. It's been a strategy for managing and engineering race, gender, and reproduction. And it's also reflected fundamental ambivalence about migrant families and their capacity for assimilation. So separated families are the final migration phantom that I want to discuss with you this week. And I've thought about the separation of families in the past in my work, especially in my book, The Lost Children, which was about refugee and displaced children in the aftermath of the Second World War. But recent events have kind of inspired me to think about family separation and migration in a more long-term perspective. And I hope maybe today I can kind of try to shed some light on how both policies toward separation, attitudes toward separation, and kind of understandings of the family at the same time have shifted over the course of the 20th and 21st century. Separated families made the modern family in the most literal way. Families were broken up by migration, sometimes by laws and red tape, sometimes physically by states intent on guarding their borders or maintaining racial purity. But they have also made the family as symbols of the ways in which migration dissolves families, as symbols of totalitarianism's assault on families, and as a source of debate over what defines a family in the first place. On the one hand, at least since the mass migrations at the end of the 19th century, social reformers, religious authorities, and government officials in countries of both emigration and immigration have generally denounced family separation as a cause of moral, social, and psychological trauma or breakdown. And they've seen family reunification as a means of creating a more stable and disciplined labor force, and sometimes as a means of preventing mixed marriages. At the same time, however, experts, policymakers, and politicians in Europe and the United States have consistently cast migrant families in pathological terms, and migration laws have persistently hindered family reunification. And ironically, these contradictions only intensified after family reunification became a primary source of migration in the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The arrival of millions of immigrants in those countries under the rubric of family reunification since the 1970s has actually resulted in ever greater scrutiny of foreign families. Some families, particularly non-white and non-European families, have increasingly been depicted in ways that suggest that they are not legitimate families at all, not worthy of unification. So to take a step back in time, at the turn of the 20th century, social reformers in Europe and the United States generally linked family separation through migration to a whole host of social and political problems. And this was true on both sides of the Atlantic, which is kind of where I'm focusing my attention in these lectures, because it's just the area that I know best. In Calabria in southern Italy, where many men had gone abroad and left their wives and children behind, these women were called widows in white, social reformers lamented that, quote, adulteries, infanticides, and vendettas are the order of the day, manifestations of that abnormal social state brought on by emigration and the consequent disequilibrium of the sexes. Not surprisingly, religious authorities were particularly worried about the consequences of family separation through migration. In 1914, two Austrian archbishops published an appeal in a journal directed directly at emigrants. The emigration of husbands without their wives and children, they argued, quote, causes the greatest harm to our people from a social point of view. Indeed, it is the darkest point of our immigration. They claimed that it was even worse when a woman left her family to go work abroad. The abandoned husbands, the bishops claim, slowly begins to visit the tavern. This is now his second home. Here he ruins his health and life, and marital fidelity is endangered. Both husband and wife are now starting to live only for themselves. And actually, these concerns were not always unfounded. Much like the migration of single women, which I discussed yesterday, the emigration of husbands, fathers, and brothers without their families sometimes did expand women's roles at home. The New York Times reported in 1907 on a Hungarian town that lost its entire male population to emigration. Quote, one by one, the male residents of Krysova felt the call across the water and they emigrated in batches until the mayor was the only adult male to remain in the village. Finally, he also succumbed to the reports of good wages and golden chances in America. As a result of this exodus of males, the women of Krysova have just elected a young woman to the place of mayor, and other female residents have been elected to fill the remainder of municipal offices. I have no idea if this story is actually true, but it was widely reported, including in places like the New York Times. Less dramatically, women took on new responsibilities within their families and communities, as well as new economic roles. Men and women learned to read and write so that they would be able to communicate with one another. Thanks in part to emigration, women and children at home worked longer hours for higher salaries as they replaced men who had gone overseas. A 1914 study of Hungarian immigration found that between 1900 and 1910, the average daily wage for a woman in Hungary increased more than 50%, an increase that was largely attributed to male immigration. Meanwhile, in North America, social reformers also lamented the moral, economic, and social effects of family separation through mass migration. And yet, at the same time, U.S. migration restrictions simultaneously frustrated families that attempted to migrate together or to reunite on American shores. And this occurred with even greater frequency as authorities stepped up efforts to exclude migrants deemed undesirable racially, physically, or mentally. In 1907, a law excluded immigrants with, quote, a mental or physical defect being of a nature which may affect the ability of such alien to earn a living. These were criteria so vague it facilitated the exclusion of migrants based simply on how they looked. More families were separated as U.S. immigration officials began to question the very legitimacy of family ties among migrants deemed racially undesirable. And for those of you who were here yesterday, I talked a bit about the panic over Japanese picture brides, which was kind of centered on sort of delegitimizing the potential families that would be created through marriage by picture. But U.S. immigration authorities also applied particular scrutiny to Chinese families. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned Chinese laborers from migrating to the United States, but an exception was made for Chinese merchants. These men, however, were rarely able to exercise their right and even less able to bring their families to join them in the United States. Authorities rarely took their familial claims at face value, barring the men's wives under suspicion of being prostitutes. But there was a loophole. Even in the era of Chinese exclusion, anyone whose father was a U.S. citizen was entitled to U.S. citizenship at birth. In the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake, which destroyed the city's birth records, there was a panic around the legitimacy of Chinese families, as many Chinese migrants claimed birthright citizenship on the basis of missing documents. Citizenship claims of this kind enabled 71,000 Chinese to enter the United States between 1920 and 1940. And these migrants were denounced as paper sons. Migration laws that targeted or excluded family members fundamentally aimed to engineer the nation's racial demographics. Efforts to ban Chinese migrant families explicitly reflected fears that laborers would settle permanently in the U.S. and reproduce. In 1886, federal district judge Lorenzo Sawyer wrote to Henry Bancroft, "When the Chinaman comes here and doesn't bring his wife here, sooner or later he dies out like a worn-out steam engine. He is simply a machine and doesn't leave 2 or 3 half-dozen children to fill his place. The problem of family separation intensified during and after the First World War. In spite of heightened scrutiny before the First World War, it was still relatively rare for European immigrants to be turned away at Ellis Island. Only 1% of the 25 million immigrants who arrived to the US from Europe between 1880 and 1914 were actually rejected. Although there were increasing forms of what was called remote control that sought to kind of prevent migrants from coming to the United States in the first place by applying greater scrutiny to them in Europe or in port cities. Then came the First World War, which brought transatlantic passenger travel basically to a standstill, separating many families for the duration. With the war's end in 1918, families hoped to finally be reunited. But in many cases, these hopes were again dashed by new immigration restrictions. In particular, the U.S. Immigration Acts of 1917, 1921, and 1924 all separated families, often permanently, and they all remained in effect for decades after the Second World War. Quote, "No one can gainsay the fact that the present legislation operates to separate families," wrote social worker Cecilia Razovsky in 1927. In 1917, the existing prohibition on Chinese migrants widened to exclude people from almost all of Asia and the Pacific. All immigrants over the age of 16 who failed to pass a literacy test were banned, along with, quote, "idiots, imbeciles, insane, or feeble-minded persons." All of these immigrants were considered threatening to both American values and racial stock, reflecting the profound influence of eugenics on migration policy in the early 20th century. These are examples of mental and physical exams for migrants, immigrants in the United States. When it came to excluding the unfit or the illegal alien, it didn't matter if the migrant happened to be the child of a U.S. citizen or the mother or father of an American child. In the offices of U.S. consuls in Eastern Europe, for example, zealous officials used intelligence tests to weed out the defective wives and children of naturalized American citizens from Poland. In 1927, Esther Reisfeld appeared at the U.S. consulate in Warsaw to request visa for herself and her 2 daughters, aged 14 and 15. Her husband was an American citizen living in the United States. She was informed that she would have to pass an IQ test to get a visa. After failing to answer questions such as, what is more necessary, the fly or the butterfly, Esther was denied a visa on the grounds that she was mentally defective. Within a few months, 33 other Jewish women married to American citizens were deemed mentally defective based on similar exams. Family members that made it to the United States in spite of such obstacles could still face separation upon arrival. One little girl arrived to live with her parents, both of whom were American citizens. She was classified as feeble-minded at Ellis Island and excluded. The child's parents, who had several other children in the United States and no one back home in Europe, were forced to make a choice: return as a family or send their disabled child home alone. They decided to bring the child back to Europe and leave her in an institution, but because both parents were U.S. citizens, no institution would accept her. The mother and child were stranded in Europe until a place was found in Berlin. The girl died there shortly thereafter. In another case, the foreign-born mother of 2 children, both U.S. citizens, was deported for insanity. Her children were placed in an institution in New York City. The mother subsequently disappeared without a trace. Even more families were separated by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which instituted national quotas that discriminated sharply against migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. For example, the new quotas in 1924 admitted less than 1/10 of the number of Czechs and Slovaks who applied for passports to the U.S. that year. In 1914, over 283,000 Italians landed on U.S. shores. In 1924, the quota was 3,845. Kenneth Rich and Mary Brandt of the Immigrants Protective League in Chicago believed that these laws were directly responsible for family breakdown. A large part of the breakdown might have been prevented if quota legislation in the United States had made proper provision for the reunion of families without delay and the obstacles which have blocked their path. There is an inexorable recurrence of the same obstacles in case after case, driving husbands and wives apart and bringing family ruin. Becoming a U.S. citizen could expedite a family's reunification, but the Naturalization Bureau was simultaneously instructed that, quote, no citizenship papers be granted to applicants here whose wives and children are abroad. The result was a nasty catch-22. Citizenship was denied to men whose families were abroad, and visas were refused to women abroad because their husbands in the United States were not citizens. As of 1927, over 173,000 wives and children of U.S. citizens were on a waiting list for visas. It is well known that the rise of Nazism in the Second World War separated millions of families through flight, deportation, and murder. But families were also separated even within the framework of humanitarianism and migration law once again. These separations reflected, at least in part, the same kinds of racist population politics that had guided immigration restrictions in the 1920s. Most famously, in the aftermath of the 1938 Kristallnacht pogroms in Germany, a growing number of German Jewish parents made the excruciating decision to send their children abroad alone. Why did they make this choice or have to make this choice? Because while the people and governments of host countries like the United States and Great Britain tended to see adult refugees as undesirable and unassimilable economic competition, refugee children did not threaten to compete with adults on the labor market and were deemed more likely to assimilate. They were therefore more readily accepted as immigrants. After Kristallnacht, several immigration schemes emerged called Kindertransports to usher Jewish children to safety in England, Palestine, and the United States without their parents. Children were chosen to be rescued in Germany and Austria by representatives from the respective Jewish communities of Germany and Austria, and in France by Quakers. In Nazi-occupied France, a Quaker official compared the selection process to interviews for a prestigious academic fellowship, observing that, quote, like a Rhodes Scholarship examination, the interview often terrifies applicants. Selecting children for emigration required making choices between those youth and children who were most at risk and those who would make the best impression, he maintained, since, quote, children in better situations are often more brilliant and of better social and moral worth. The Quakers were nonetheless optimistic that, quote, after morons, diseased, and amoral children have been sifted out, there is sure to be an embarrassment of riches. Refugee children, concerned about their parents back home, were burdened with a heavy obligation to make themselves loved so that more refugees, including their own family members, could potentially follow them to safety. One Jewish newspaper lamented in Germany, so many of the children serve as advertisements for those remaining behind through their charm and attractiveness. But unfortunately, not all display the flawless manners required for winning friends for Jewish children in England. Even after the war, U.S. migration laws continued to separate families within the framework of humanitarianism. In 1948 and 1950, the U.S. Displaced Persons Act enabled over 400,000 European refugees to enter the United States outside the quota. But strict exclusion criteria remained in place. The most desirable refugees were those who were young, able to work, healthy, and considered assimilable. That meant children and youth, often without their parents. In May of 1951, for example, the mother of Ruth Karen, who was 13 years old, faced a painful decision. When her daughter was an infant, the entire family attempted to escape Nazi Germany for Palestine, but they were caught and interned in Romania, and most of the family was killed in Auschwitz. Only Ruth and her mother survived and ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany run by the International Refugee Organization. In 1951, Ruth Karen was chosen to emigrate to the United States under the U.S. Displaced Persons Act, but her mother, who was sick, was excluded, and so she had to go alone. An organization called European Jewish Children's Aid would place her with American parents. Ruth Karen's mother was reluctant to sign the forms relinquishing her parental rights. Once her daughter was gone, she confided to a social worker there would be nothing left to do but poison herself. But the social worker pressured Ruth's mother to consider the matter with a cool head. By focusing on her own fears of being alone, she advised she was selfishly putting her own emotions ahead of her daughter's best interests. Ruth's mother signed the form. Ruth Karen was not ripped from the arms of her mother by border officials, but U.S. immigration laws certainly separated this child from her mother, not the guards of Nazi concentration camps. During the Cold War, U.S. judges and migration officials made other decisions to separate parents and children based on the alleged best interests of the children. When children or youth were separated from parents or relatives across the Iron Curtain, for example, U.S. judges often ruled that they should not be repatriated to their families because it was not in the best interests of the child to grow up in a communist country. In one case in 1947, 3 American-born children of an Armenian immigrant were separated from their parents when courts decided that the parents did not have the right to repatriate them to the USSR. Hamportson Cholokian had fled Armenia for the United States in 1913, but by 1942 his wife had been committed to an insane asylum and his children were scattered to welfare institutions. Unable to care for them on his own, he decided to repatriate to the Soviet Union with his family in 1947. But the children were in the custody of a Catholic welfare institution that refused to relinquish them. When the case reached the courts, the judge denied Cholokian the custody of his children on the grounds that if they left for the USSR, they would not be able to later reclaim their U.S. citizenship. The judge concluded it would not be to the best interests of these children to be taken to Soviet Armenia, even though it results in the temporary or even permanent separation of these children from their parents. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal of the case, and the children were never reunited with their parents. In the United States, the quota system based on national origins was finally dismantled in 1965 in favor of a system that actually favored family reunification. During the election campaign of 1960, then Senator John F. Kennedy argued that, quote, "the most important immediate objective of immigration reform is reuniting families. There are many new citizens in America whose immediate families are in other lands waiting patiently to join them. We have a social obligation to bring these families together." The 1965, actually I got ahead in the slide. Here's Johnson signing the 1965 Act. The 1965 Immigration Act no longer limited visas for the spouses, children, or parents of U.S. citizens and created preferences for adult children, brothers and sisters, as well as the immediate families of permanent residents. And the effect was dramatic. Between 1930 and 1940, 17% of the migrants who arrived in the U.S. did so under the rubric of family reunification, a total of around 91,000 people. Between 2001 and 2010, that number increased to 6,760,000 people, 64% of the total number of immigrants coming to the United States. This reform was not motivated entirely by the kinds of humanitarian sentiments cited by JFK, however. Many political leaders who opposed non-white immigration to the United States believed that migrants arriving based on family-based preferences would be mostly white, since the majority of immigrants in 1965 were of European origin. Others advocated family reunification because they hoped it would prevent intermarriage. Things turned out very differently, however, as the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 not only brought back mass immigration in the United States, but also dramatically increased the number of migrants coming from outside of Europe, from 1 out of 8 in 1960 to 9 out of 10 in 2010. This does not mean that migrant families were not vulnerable to separation after 1965, however, particularly non-white families. In 1975, as North Vietnamese forces closed in on South Vietnam, the United States government launched Operation Baby Lift, which airlifted approximately 2,000 children out of South Vietnam, supposedly to save them from impending massacre by the North Vietnamese army. The children, who were depicted as war orphans who had been abandoned by their parents, were then placed in U.S. homes for adoption. But as it turned out, many of the children were not orphans at all. They had living family members who hoped to reclaim them. Some parents had temporarily placed their children in orphanages because they were too poor to support them. Others had entrusted their children to U.S. organizations and charities for safekeeping because they feared an impending bloodbath. At least 715 of the children's parents had not signed releases relinquishing custody, and in another 553 cases, family members had signed the releases only under great duress. A class action lawsuit in the United States by an organization representing these children's family members was dismissed And so custody disputes played out on a case-by-case basis, but only if the Vietnamese family members could come to the United States, had the resources and abilities to locate their children, and funds for a long legal battle. One mother, Mrs. Hightal Pop, landed in California as a refugee in 1975. She spent the next 5 years trying to reclaim 2 of her children who had been placed with an adoptive family in Connecticut. In an open letter, she appealed, "To understand my story, think you are caught upstairs in a burning house. To save your babies' lives, you drop them to people on the ground to catch. It's good that people would catch them, but then you find a way to get out of the fire too and thank the people for catching your babies, and you try to take your babies with you. But the people say, oh no, these are our babies now, you can't have them back." She finally won her case and regained custody of her 2 boys in 1980. Repeatedly since the 1980s, legislators in the United States have attempted to narrow the law's definition of family in order to restrict family reunification. Most recently, a bill introduced to the Senate in 2007 proposed to eliminate preferences for brothers, sisters, and parents of citizens. Jeff Sessions, who was then a Republican senator from Alabama, argued, quote, "Why should the fact that we give one person a glorious thing, citizenship in the United States, entitle them to bring maybe tens of other people?" The bill didn't pass, but President Trump has frequently denounced so-called chain migration and called for family preferences to be replaced by economic preferences. The families most vulnerable to separation are those with mixed status, as the non-authorized parents of children who are citizens have been caught up in mass waves of deportation, including under the Obama administration. In 2011, more than 5,000 children were in foster care because of their parents' deportation or detention. A similar story has played out in post-war Europe. First, the embrace of family reunification, followed by its gradual erosion, particularly for non-European families. During the economic boom of the 1950s and 60s, there was an insatiable demand for labor in much of Western Europe. Policymakers sought to meet this demand by importing foreign workers. These are guest workers, so-called guest workers arriving in Germany. The West German government negotiated agreements with Italy, Greece, Spain, Turkey, Portugal, Morocco, and Yugoslavia to recruit these so-called guest workers. The idea was that these workers would take up employment in Germany on the assumption that they would be a temporary and flexible labor force who would eventually return home. There were at least 2.5 million foreign workers living in West Germany by 1973. In France, Britain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, post-war migration was intimately linked to histories of colonialism. In 1946 and 47, Algerian Muslims had been granted French citizenship and the right to move freely between Algeria and the French mainland. Between 1946 and 1954, the number of Algerians in France rose from 22,000 to over 200,000. And then as a direct result of decolonization in Algeria, 1 million French Algerians, the so-called Pieds Noirs, fled to France. Under the terms of the Avion Accord, which established Algerian independence, Algerians were to enjoy relatively free movement between Algeria and France. By 1973, there were 2.3 million foreign workers in France, 11% of the workforce. In Britain, citizens of the former British Empire, including migrants from the West Indies, India, Pakistan, and former British colonies in Africa, had a presumptive right of permanent residence and citizenship in the metropole. But the government began to restrict immigration in 1962, explicitly controlling and limiting non-white immigration. And in 1968, British citizenship was restricted to persons with at least one British parent. When the economic boom ended in the 1970s and the early 1970s, Britain, France, and Germany all introduced new restrictions on migration. But these laws had unanticipated consequences. Fearing further restrictions, many foreign workers sought to bring their families to settle permanently in Europe. So basically, because they no longer would enjoy the freedom to move back and forth easily, many migrants brought their families to join them. Family reunification in the 1970s changed the demographic character of immigrant communities in Europe as it had in the US. A greater number of women and children became a part of immigrant communities and were born in Europe. More settled immigrant communities made more demands on the state for citizenship rights. And in West Germany, where the government did not restrict family migration at all, the immigrant population grew from 2.6 million in 1973 to 4.4 million by 1980. The arrival of these family members generated intense scrutiny of migrant families. The so-called problem of the foreign family became a central theme of social scientific research, policymaking, and of depictions of migrants in popular culture. After decades in which the separation of families through migration had been portrayed as a social and humanitarian crisis, these discussions now began to suggest that the reunification of families might not be so desirable after all. Ironically, the problem of separated families before the Second World War had often been framed in terms of a breakdown of patriarchal authority and gender roles. But by the 1970s, foreign families were often pathologized precisely for their supposedly backward family values. Recalling older debates about Asian immigrants in the United States, these discussions called into question whether migrant families were actually legitimate families at all. A great deal of European discussion of the problem migrant family focused on the children of immigrants, who are often now depicted as victims of their own parents. Critics of family reunification suggested that it was not actually in children's best interest to be reunified with their parents. In West Germany in 1974, for example, the government reformed the way so-called Kindergeld, or child money benefit, was paid to migrant workers. The payment was decreased if the child remained home in Turkey. As Lauren Stokes has shown, that reform provoked massive suspicion on the part of Germans that migrant parents did not want to bring their children to join them in Germany because they loved or cared for them or to give them a chance at a better life. Rather, they brought their children to get more Kindergeld. Other reformers began to argue that it was not in the best interests of children to be reunited with their parents because the children were being forced into child labor. Many children of guest workers are growing up illiterate, warned an editorial published in the Rheinische Merkur in 1969. The author claimed that large numbers of children of foreign workers in Germany were not attending school because their parents wouldn't allow them to. Quote, in many cases, the parents care little if the young man from Padua wants to go to school to improve his future instead of working at the polishing machine in a shoe factory, or that the 14-year-old girl from Valencia would rather stick her nose in reading and arithmetic books than help her mother clean a half-dozen doctor's offices every day. There were multiple implications to stories like this one, and I just gave you one example, but there were many. First, that immigrant families were economic units rather than emotional or affective units, that migrant parents did not care about their children's best interests. Second, that migrant families were backward and did not assimilate to German values. Third, the failure of immigrant children to thrive in Germany was the fault of their parents. And fourth, the future of Germany itself was threatened by a growing underclass of illiterate foreigners. Even after family reunification became a dominant principle of immigration law, experts worried about how well immigrant children would be prepared for their presumed return to their countries of origin, in the process framing return as the most desirable outcome. In a 1973 report to the European Union, for example, a French official estimated that there were 2 million children of foreigners in France. The challenge, he argued, was on the one hand to facilitate integration, quote, and at the same time to preserve their native culture in order to prevent a rupture with their family milieu and to preserve the chances of reintegration on the occasion of their eventually desired return to their countries of origin. In 1975, the European Union's Committee on Cultural Affairs and Youth reported to the EU Council on the integration of immigrant children in the EU. There is no lack of evidence to show that children of migrant workers are, like many children from poor homes, only more so, are educational misfits. The committee proposed that member states should encourage migrant children to retain ties with their languages and countries of origin so that, quote, he or she does not become a person without a country and can later readapt to life in his or her country of origin. And this report was notable on the one hand for endorsing bilingualism and bilingual education, but multiculturalism here, bilingualism here, was only a means to eventually remove difference through return migration. Many European experts in the 1970s were meanwhile skeptical that a child could belong to multiple cultures. In West Germany, a consensus formed in the 1970s that children brought to Germany too late would never become proficient in German or in their native language, that they would become psychologically scarred outsiders for life. As of 1981, children from migrants outside the EU could only join their parents in Germany if they were under the age of 16, and only if both parents resided in Germany. And repeatedly, reformers attempted but failed to reduce that age to 6. Authorities also increasingly scrutinized the authenticity of binational marriages and families. In the 1980s, a panic erupted about marriages between Europeans and non-Europeans, suspected of being marriages of convenience or visa marriages. In this case, family reunification was discredited as a form of labor migration in disguise. Any family migrant who wanted to work was considered illegitimate. In the United Kingdom between 1969 and 1974, only British men were eligible to bring foreign spouses to Britain, both because it was a patriarchal privilege of men to confer citizenship on their wives and children, and because women were not considered a competitive threat on the labor market. That ban on husbands was briefly lifted in 1974 and then reinstated by the Conservative government in 1979. Then in 1983, the Home Office of the United Kingdom imposed a new primary purpose clause. And this forbade the husbands of foreign husbands of British women from coming to the UK if it was suspected that the, quote, primary purpose of the marriage was a visa. The purported rationale was that the government needed to protect white British women from being tricked into a, quote, marriage of convenience by foreign men, a fear that built on centuries-old tropes depicting non-white men as predators of white women. The primary purpose law had an immediate effect. In the year after it was implemented, 1,850 applicants of non-British spouses for residency permits were turned down. All of the rejected applications were from persons of color. In 1985, the UK was actually condemned by the European Court of Human Rights for discrimination against women, and in response, the British government began to subject foreign wives to the primary purpose test, as well as foreign husbands. These regulations generated outcry from those affected, as well as feminists who took up their cause. In 1987, for example, one woman in Manchester appealed to the European Union's Committee on Human Rights to protest the deportation of her husband. In her petition, she framed the issue in terms of both gender discrimination and human rights. I have the rights that every British citizen has. I have the right to choose whom I marry and where I live. My husband is no criminal and has committed no crime, yet he is being treated like a criminal by the Home Office. Wives, husbands, and children are also valuable to each other, that to separate them is totally unjust, totally inhumane. A similar panic about visa marriages erupted in Germany in the 1980s. Officials in Saxony sent a circular around in 1981 instructing officials to apply greater scrutiny to binational marriages, particularly whenever the foreign fiancé was, quote, a national of a developing country. Women married to foreigners formed a pressure group to protest discriminatory treatment as well as the invasive nature of interrogations and home visits. They protested that couples were required to, quote, prove that they are married according with the preconceived ideas of the alien's authority. Even when individuals succeeded in bringing their foreign spouses to Germany, they faced obstacles. Migrants coming to Germany under the rubric of family reunification were not legally allowed to work. There were also instances in which migrants who entered Germany as family members were threatened with expulsion in case of their spouse's death, in the event of a divorce or separation, or if they applied for public assistance. There was a pattern also of preventing family reunification on the basis of alleged shortcomings that were the product of government policies, inequality, and discrimination. In Germany, migrants were required to demonstrate that they had adequate housing in order to bring their families members to join them, often an insurmountable obstacle. In France, foreign workers who wanted to bring their spouses or children to France were required to have an apartment with 14 square meters of space for each adult and 7 square meters for every child, a standard which at least 50% of Parisians could not meet. In 1983, out of 5,500 demands for family reunions in Paris, only 700 were granted. Across the 20th century, attitudes toward and policies regarding family reunification have reflected intense ambivalence about the migrant family itself. Opponents of migration have undermined migrants' families' demands for reunion by depicting family migrants as economic migrants, by discrediting the effective ties that have linked migrant families and by depicting migrant families as illegitimate or culturally inassimilable. As a result, there has been, in Europe and the United States, a gradual turn away from family reunification in immigration law. In the United States, most recently, the separation of families has been justified by language that suggests that migrant families are somehow not real families, that migrant parents don't care about their children. When images of migrant children torn from their parents at the US-Mexico border provoked humanitarian outrage, Trump administration officials blamed parents. After 2 migrant children died in the custody of U.S. border officials, Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen argued that the children were victims of their parents, not the U.S. state. Their deaths were, quote, the direct result of an immigration system that rewards parents for sending their children across the border alone, a system that prevents parents who bring their children on a dangerous and illegal journey from facing consequences for their actions. Of the 3 migration phantoms I've discussed this week, separated families may continue to haunt us the most. They have most directly made the modern family by unmaking it, and they have made the modern family as models of what families should not be. But they have also come to stand in for the values of our society at large. Mass migration has made the modern family because I believe it has dramatically loosened family ties over the course of the last 150 years. And because migrant families have so often been the other against which normative families are defined. On balance, I would argue that mass migration has often unsettled traditional gender roles, enabling women to achieve a greater degree of economic and social autonomy, or at least the chance to create families on their own terms. The runaways and single women who populated my first 2 talks were important protagonists in the history of migration and the history of women, gender, and sexuality in the last 150 years. Their story should not be forgotten, particularly since the story of female migration is not only one of victimization. But nor should we forget the stories of families separated, not by individual decision, opportunity, or cultural change, but by governments intent on managing the racial and gender composition of their populations. Government officials who claim to value families while delegitimizing and separating families that don't resemble their own. We should not sentimentalize the family, but I think we should continue to put the migrant family at the center of our inquiry because it holds the key to answering so many questions that continue to shape the contemporary world. Why, how, and when individuals have moved away or remained home, who has had the right to create homes and families in new places, and how both real and ideal families have been made or unmade by mass migration. Thank you.
I will walk around with the microphone for questions.
Thanks again, Tara, for this really illuminating talk. I really, really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So I have a question about this sort of causal story that you're telling, and I'm wondering if you could flesh it out a bit for us. So the overall chronology is very convincing. What I'd like to hear more about is your explanation for why we have these shifts over time. It seems to me that one potential explanation, which you gestured at, is economic in nature, or at least the perception that a country needs certain kinds of labor, and that perception of labor need determines migrant policy. Another explanation could basically foreground political ideologies and certain visions of, familyism and certain understandings of justice that would determine family reunification policies, or certain conceptions of how a nation state needs to, in fact, assert or reassert its national identity, and certain implications for the resurgence of nationalism in shaping migrant policy. So I'm wondering if you could kind of adjudicate between those 2 options, or maybe even offer a third or a fourth option that to you helps, again, explain the causes behind these shifts in policy?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question and a hard one. I think I'm going to punt. I have to think about it more to come up with a more coherent answer. But I would say, in some ways, it's hard to. I think it's kind of not an either or. I mean, I know that's a little bit not answering the question, but I'm reminded of there's a really famous quote. I can't remember who said it. Somebody here probably knows. It wasn't Konrad Adenauer, I don't think, but it was like, we wanted labor and people came. And we asked for hands and we got people. Exactly. It's some version of that. And actually there's a second half of the quotation that refers to Nazis that never gets cited that I don't remember either. But anyway, the point is that sometimes economic needs dictate certain aspects of policy, but then don't take into account the full human and cultural and political and social consequences. And I think you see a little bit of that over the course, particularly of the late 20th century. I also would say, I think the answer to your question probably is different in different contexts. I don't think it's coincidental that West Germany probably had the most liberal family reunification policy up until recent times, and maybe still, because there was a very powerful memory of kind of one of the greatest evils of both Nazism and communism being the separation of families. So there was a kind of strong ideological impulse to reunite families. The same kinds of memories don't necessarily dominate public opinion in the United States even, or France or Britain. So probably you'd have to get to a much more fine-grained analysis of different contexts to sort of really figure this out. But you could argue that in the recent shift away from family migration, I am just thinking out loud here, we could blame neoliberalism. That's always a strategy. I don't really know, though. I really have to think a bit more, because I think it's very hard to separate economics and ideology and understanding political change, basically. And I wouldn't want to necessarily say one is more important than the other.
So thank you, Tara, again for this lecture. One of the things that's come up in multiple lectures has related to this idea about internal versus external dynamics. So the importance of thinking about, in lecture one, for instance, about transients within the United States, and then thinking about mobility across sovereign borders. So I wondered if, as you come to the end of the lecture series, if you could reflect a little bit more schematically on that question, and in particular in relation to this idea about constructing the family. Another question that's come up in both sessions has been, what is the modern family? Can it be imagined more expansively? Is it always heteronormative? Is it about grandparents? How the different ways that it can be imagined. So as you were talking, I was thinking about this idea that the immigrant family is always the bad family. But within US history, there have been other people who have been labeled as bad families. So African American families, Native American families whose children were taken from them. Also ideas about social class and family, ideas about gay couples and whether they should be able to adopt. All of these questions have also been discussed very extensively beyond the framework of immigration. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how those dynamics might influence the kind of separation of families across borders. In particular, perhaps there's discursive similarities, perhaps there are personnel who have worked in both of these contexts at the physical border as well as internally with non-immigrant populations, or maybe there are institutional ties between these two contexts. So I know it's a big question, but is there a way of thinking about this within that dynamic that's come up in the multiple lectures?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think yes. I think the answer is yes, even though I didn't do the work here, but I think it could be done. Particularly insofar as, I'm just now thinking, kind of narrowing my focus a little bit to say the interwar period, there's a kind of rise of a professionalization of social work, and a lot of the characters, the people, the types of people who are making calls about good or bad families among migrants, policing the borders, staffing the Travelers Aid Society offices and so on and so forth, are the same people or getting the same training as the people who are, managing the local social work offices or other kind of organs of social policy domestically that are making judgment calls about, good and bad families. So I think there's very clear linkages in that respect. It would be very interesting to kind of go even more fine-grained and think. I think you could actually, you could analyze at a very sort of a more in-depth level, kind of comparing, the way Native American, African American, and immigrant families, or even Italian versus Jewish, or versus Chinese, you could actually really analyze all of those in relationship to one another. I think one really concrete link also is just in the social sciences. Like a lot of the social sociology that developed around immigration in the Chicago School of Sociology, Znaniecki and Thomas, Robert Park, all of these people, they studied immigrants and then kind of applied the same ideas to African Americans in urban contexts. So there was kind of direct transfer of ideas and forms of pathologization often from one place to another. So I think there's both like the institutional and personnel relationships there are really concrete and would probably be quite easy to trace, in fact, even though I didn't. So thank you for the question.
Hi. Given what you said about kind of like eugenics serving a role in wanting to limit immigration, when people did get in, whether they were like in family units or individuals, do you know anything about what kind of measures were taken, whether it be like geographically or like systemically, to keep them apart from people like already living in the country, whether it be through like housing or other things like that?
Yes. I mean, the answer to that question varies a lot based on time and place. But certainly there were both intentional and structural, kind of unintentional ways in which migrants often were segregated geographically. Sometimes also grouped together by choice to be part of a community, so you can't always say that like that kind of separation is a result of discrimination, but it often was. There were also efforts to, there was also kind of concerted efforts at various points in time to try and get migrants to spread out, right? Not to cluster together under the idea that this would facilitate assimilation. So for example, in Germany in the post-war period, there would be restrictions on the number of immigrants who could live in particular neighborhoods, no more than 10% or something like that. And then, otherwise, I think it comes down more to social policies and kind of racial politics in different contexts locally. It's hard to sort of generalize about that. But certainly kind of eugenics had a really important influence on social policy, not just up to the Second World War, but well after. Yeah.
Is there any country that you can point to that has what you consider to be a good, effective immigration policy? And if not, or maybe even so, are any of our political candidates proposing an immigration policy that makes sense to you?
Well, I think there's better and worse immigration policies. And so I would say, in this talk, I've kind of hit a lot of the low points. But I do think there have been moments in our own country's history, that in which, you know, borders have been more open and not necessarily to kind of the detriment of society. So I don't, you know, I'm not a policymaker. I don't think I have the answers in terms of like the most just and effective immigration policy, but kind of as a historian, I can say that there have been better and worse moments in our own country's history, and also in the history of the European countries that I know well. And I think sometimes both those high moments and low, you know, those high moments and low moments get forgotten. I mean, not only do we forget kind of, oh, we've done this before, we've separated families before, and that's really ugly, but I think, you know, successful migrations often get forgotten as well. So kind of histories in which large numbers of migrants came here or to other countries and were integrated relatively unproblematically. So for example, just one thing that kind of comes to mind that's sort of interesting is that nowadays in Europe, you'll hear a lot about kind of how problematic Islamic migration is, and that, you know, that's the kind of boogeyman of the migrant wave coming into Europe. But until the 1980s in West Germany, Muslim migrants were considered totally unproblematic. So it's a relatively new, it's like a relatively new phantom in a sense there. So I'm not saying like the 1960s were a great time in German history necessarily. There's ups and downs, but it's not always been the way it is now. And I think it is easy to forget both the low points and kind of moments in which it was easier for people to make a new life in a new place, and maybe didn't have the negative consequences that people are scared with today.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. It's such a big story that you're telling about the United States and other countries as well. So I was wondering, like, what makes this all part of the same story, right? And I think you were getting at it a little bit in answering this last question, but what do you think then the takeaway is? What do we learn from combining the examples of immigration in the United States and in these different countries in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm still sort of trying to figure that out myself on some level. It's clear that something is going on today, sort of, that transcends our own borders in terms of migration politics and policies. And that's clearly been true at other moments in time too. So, you know, kind of in some of my other work, I'm looking at the interwar period as a moment of deglobalization. And it is kind of a global moment of deglobalization. Everywhere around the world, there's attempts to limit migration and trade. And we're seem to be at a similar kind of moment today. And I hope that by putting multiple examples together, you know, like I'm sort of looking for those connections in a way. I don't know that I necessarily have them, but I do think you know, what we do see is the very flexible way in which the images of the family are used to include or exclude migrants, kind of the changes over time in how ideal families have been defined. And I think especially the way what is really striking to me is the way in which the moment that family reunification becomes privileged in all of these contexts, there's this kind of scrutiny applied to families that delegitimizes them and to foreign families. I think that that's a kind of ongoing dynamic and maybe more obvious when you take a broader picture and look at it across multiple countries and contexts. But I'm not sure, like, I don't really have a schematic answer to the question. I mean, I hope that what people have taken away from these talks is some greater understanding of the extent to which migration politics and family politics have been intertwined over the course of the 20th century and in the present day. In historiographic terms, you know, I mentioned this yesterday, I think. International histories tend not to be histories of the family, and histories of the family tend not to be written on a kind of transnational or international scale. I think kind of we can learn something new from that perspective, and that's a little bit what I'm trying to accomplish as well.
I just have a short comment, maybe, because we're talking about migration into the desired country, but there was also a movement of emigration, which was very much encouraged. For instance, in England, 19th century, when the colonization was at its peak, they were trying to get people to Canada, promising them that this is the wonderful, you know, climate there, and they will be thriving. So there are movements back and forth. So this is my first comment. The other one is that it's very interesting, just a comment, very interesting. In fact, today, Europe needs it the other way. It really needs those immigrants for, as we heard and from you, simply economic reasons. Mm-hmm. And those children may be the future of depopulated Europe because there are no children there. And yet, so maybe there's something socially that pertains to social psychology of people that is deeper than even their own interests.
Yes. I mean, I definitely agree that emigration as well as immigration is an important part of this story. And in some of my other work, I've tried to talk a lot about how anxieties about emigration were also linked to fears of the dissolution of families, but also, you know, kind of fantasies of creating new families, like when, you know, orphans are shipped overseas from the British Empire, or single women, right, or who are seen as excess women are kind of encouraged to go out to the colonies. So there's all different ways in which migration in those contexts, emigration as well as immigration, has become a tool of population politics over the course of the last 2 centuries. I think the second point, in some ways, that you made about how, like, there's a kind of, I guess, a hypocrisy between, on the one hand, in many places in Europe, an active pronatalist campaign that sort of, you know, we need more babies, and immigration restriction. That sort of points, on the one hand, I think, to the importance of politics, ideology, and psychology in shaping these policies. On the other hand, I think it is important, I haven't done this work, but economists have, to look at in a more fine-grained way. I mean, there are winners and losers when it comes to immigration. So even if a state itself may kind of project that 20 years down the road labor is needed, it may still be the case that immigration right now is going to negatively affect certain groups of the population economically. So there may not be as much hypocrisy there as there seems to be, but that's certainly one of the contradictions we're seeing in Europe today.
Tara, I have a question about, I think maybe you can say it's the relation of perception to reality. And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question as a preface. I've been thinking a lot about anti-Semitic reactions to the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the question is, to what degree is it based on some degree of reality that the revolution, if not was driven by Jews, then benefited Jews particularly. And it's not an easy one to sort through. So with perceptions of immigrant families, family structures, and their values, is the perception correct that these families do bring different values, if not alien or subversive or detrimental to the larger new society, that certainly different? Is that a misperception, or is it an accurate perception understood in narrow or bigoted or unsympathetic ways? So is the problem a misunderstanding, in other words, seeing people as foreigners when they're actually not just different, not that different, but bigotry misfilters their perceptions to see people as, again, different and alien, or in fact are immigrants who have been coming into any number of European countries quite different. Well, then the question becomes, are the differences good for the larger society or not?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. It's a really good one. It's funny. I thought you were going to go in a different direction, which is one that I've been thinking about more, but your question is equally important, which is that I think in thinking about this talk, I've been thinking a lot about gender, and I'd come increasingly to the conclusion over the course, I guess, of 15 years of doing migration research with gender either at the center or on the margins, that kind of the panic around gender, the unsettling of families and gender crisis was not just imagined. Actually, there was some there. I think on the question of cultural difference, like, one may have to get down to a level that I clearly have not gone here, because I can think of really concrete examples. Just even from research I did a couple weeks ago about, have you ever heard of this, there was this Jewish settlement in New Jersey of textile workers who were supposed to become farmers. Anyway, it's a great story. But, this was a group that they were all immigrants, and they were really feared on these grounds of bringing foreign values to rural New Jersey. And they were, they organized a parade to demonstrate how 100% American they were, to use that term of the 1920s. So I feel like when I look at that case, it's one where it seems the difference is more imagined than real, although there is difference. I think there could be other cases. I think there are certainly other cases where difference is real, and then the issue is kind of, how does a society think about difference, and what kinds of differences are seen as threatening and why. But I think that's like a really important question to address, and I want to think about it more. Thank you.
Hello, I just want to say first that I really was interested and appreciate that tie to current as well as to the past. And I was curious to what similarities and differences in the rhetoric used by the politicians pushing these types of policies that separate families stand out to you.
Similarities and differences.
Yeah, to these past policies that separated families to some of the current ones that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, a common thread is sort of both, a pathologization of difference, that different kinds of families are sort of threatening to our values. On the other hand, one interesting change that you see is that in the early 20th century, there was some discussion of these families from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe are backward, and that's problematic. But I think there was much more concern about how migration itself and separation itself was going to undermine traditional norms of gender and family. Whereas I would say in the most recent kind of discussions that problematize migrant families, you're much more likely to see a pathologization based on the idea that these are backwards families that don't assimilate to our kind of modern Western norms. I don't know that holds 100%, but I do think that you can kind of see a change over time there, or some difference. I think that the idea since the early 20th century of children's best interests has been used very strategically to legitimize or delegitimize certain kinds of family separation or reunification. And you kind of can see that play out over and over again in various contexts. And then I guess the ways in which these debates about family reunification and attempts to limit reunification are kind of fundamentally about race on some level. That's, I think, been true, at least in the United States, since the early 20th century, even if the particular racial threats have changed over time. I mean, President Trump certainly doesn't have a problem with his own immigrant wife, right? Or previous wife as well. So certain immigrant groups are seen as more desirable than others, and that's been the case, a kind of hierarchization of migrants. That's been the case since the early 20th century.
Maybe in this lull, I'll take an opportunity to ask my own question, which has been hovering between Fran and Tony's question, which is one of the things I've been really impressed with over the past 3 nights is your ability to always denationalize the family when you use it. It's always the modern family, not the modern American family, or the modern British family, or the modern German family, Czech, Slovak, etc., Jewish. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more methodologically of the advantages you think of staying at that level in your analysis as opposed to bringing in sort of a national definition. What advantages does that bring? And at the other hand, are there meaningful differences that it erases?
Yeah, that's great. So I think, right, I think in general, the way a study like this would be framed, and maybe for good reasons, would be in terms of a specific national story. I don't tend to think that way. I'm not necessarily, I think that has both advantages and disadvantages, you say. I think in the course of doing research that's taken me across so many different national borders, I'm inclined to see more similarities than differences in these kinds of patterns of inclusion and exclusion. But I wouldn't want to say that there isn't, I mean, if you kind of zoomed in locally at particularly how migration restrictions are being enacted. I mean, politicians are certainly talking about the American family, the German family, the French family, and they understand each of those families to have particularities and differences. And oftentimes, in particular, they would probably define themselves against an American family. So I think in terms of some of the actors I'm talking about, there would have been very kind of differing conceptions of what the ideal family is. And you can see that kind of play out in the sorts of which migrants are seen as more or less threatening. And that's kind of based on individual national histories, colonial histories, right, versus West Germany that has a different kind of immediate past, a different kind of legacy to contend with in shaping its migration policies. So I think one could say something important and interesting about each of these cases. I think by zooming out, I am trying to sort of emphasize a broader pattern, which is to say that in every case, even if the specific family that's imagined might have a different shade or flavor, there's a similar way in which migration, at least since the late 19th century, has been a critical way in which those ideals were formed and transformed. That's kind of the pro.
Yeah, I think that was really, I think it's a really interesting discussion about this. And one thing that I would maybe think about just, again, like what are those then international institutions that are kind of the glue sort of holding these ideas together? I mean, you mentioned social sciences. I'm also thinking about international law, that in some ways it seems to me that when you have different institutions internationally that define the family a certain way and set up certain rights, and that then gives different countries something to push up against, and that might be sort of part of just the texture of the things that are holding these different things together.
No, that's a great point. And as you were talking, I was just thinking like a lot of my sources for the later half of this talk come from the archives of the European Union, which is kind of creating norms that are to transcend national boundaries about how migration law and family reunification and what's good and bad practice. So that's kind of where you might see, even though there's still differences nationally, clearly you kind of see a convergence, at least in the discussion that's taking place.
Okay, allow me to thank Sky Donnie and the George L. Mosse program for hosting the lectures this year. And please join me in a hearty thank you to Professor Zahra for 3 very stimulating lectures. Thank you.